Caleb Granger was found dead in the woods. 2 weeks later, his father, David Granger, stood over his son's casket and opened fire on his own family, killing 5 people in under 2 minutes. What could push a father to massacre his loved ones at a funeral? As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered dark secrets, a staged death, and a family built on lies. This wasn't just grief. It was something far more sinister. Caleb Granger was just 17 years old when his life ended, under mysterious and tragic circumstances. A junior at Fairview Central High, Caleb was the kind of teenager who seemed to live quietly on the sidelines. He didn't make much noise, didn't attract attention, and mostly kept to himself.
Ow.
Teachers described him as polite but distant, and though he was never in trouble, he also never seemed entirely present. His classmates rarely included him in their social circles, but no one had a bad word to say about him either. In a town like Fairview, where people knew their neighbors and doors were rarely locked, Caleb's quietness didn't raise any alarms until it was too late. On the afternoon of March 3, 2024, Caleb didn't come home from school. His parents, David and Susan Granger, initially assumed he had stayed late for an activity or gone to a friend's house. But as evening fell and no messages came in, their concern began to grow. By nightfall, they called the police. A search was quickly organized, involving family, neighbors, and law enforcement. The next morning, his body was discovered in the wooded area behind the high school. He was lying face up on a bed of dead leaves, a revolver resting in the mud beside him. A single gunshot wound to the head left little doubt about what had happened. Next, to his body, officers found a note folded tightly in his jacket pocket. The handwriting was Caleb's. It spoke vaguely of pain, of pressure, of being tired. The note didn't name anyone or explain exactly what had pushed him to this point, but its tone was heavy with sorrow. To everyone involved, it seemed to be a suicide. The town grieved. At school, his desk was left empty for a week, covered in cards and flowers. His teachers held back tears during morning announcements. The community gathered around the Grangers, offering food, prayers, and sympathy. But behind the public mourning, something else was happening, something quieter or troubling. David Granger, a former Marine and now a truck mechanic, didn't react to his son's death the way most expected. He didn't cry at the vigil. He didn't speak at the school memorial. Instead, he paced. He sat in silence. He avoided people. Friends said he looked like he hadn't slept in days, began obsessively checking the locks on the doors at night. He sat for hours in his truck, with the engine off, staring out at the road. Some said he was just in shock that this was how some men handled grief, but others felt something darker lurking beneath his silence. Susan, his wife, tried to hold the family together. Caleb's older siblings, Ryan and Madison, came home from college and tried to comfort their parents. Still, nothing seemed to ease the heavy cloud that had settled over their home. Then, little by little, strange things began to emerge, details that didn't quite make sense. Caleb's phone was missing. A friend mentioned he had been upset days before his death, but wouldn't say why. His last online messages were deleted. And slowly, the picture of Caleb's final days began to look less like a suicide and more like a secret waiting to explode. The day of Caleb Granger's funeral arrived under a bright, cloudless sky. It was one of those cold but sunny mornings that didn't match the heaviness in the air. Dozens of people gathered at Evergreen Cemetery, a peaceful plot of land on the edge of Fairview, where the bare trees stood like silent witnesses. A large white tent had been set up near the freshly dug grave, surrounded by flower arrangements and folding chairs. The entire town seemed to have shown up. Friends, classmates, teachers, and neighbors all stood quietly, waiting to pay their respects. It should have been a solemn goodbye, a moment for closure and comfort. But for some reason, everyone felt an uneasiness they couldn't explain. David Granger sat in the front row with his wife Susan beside him, her hands clenched tightly. In her lap, their surviving children, Ryan and Madison, stood off to the side, speaking little to anyone. Ryan looked pale, almost sick. Madison stared down at her shoes the entire time, barely acknowledging people who offered their condolences. Family members murmured to one another, noting the strange tension between them. There were no embraces between siblings, no comforting words exchanged. The family looked shattered, not just with grief, but as if something had fractured them long before that morning. As the ceremony began, the pastor stepped forward and spoke about Caleb's life. He talked about his quiet kindness, his struggle to find his place in the world, and the pain of losing someone so young. The words drifted through the crisp air, but many in attendance weren't listening. They were watching David, who sat unnaturally still, his eyes locked on the casket. His expression was unreadable, fixed, almost like a man waiting for something to happen. A few people later said they noticed his hand shaking. Others said he was mumbling to himself, but no one had any idea what he was about to do. As the final prayer ended, David stood up. First, people assumed he wanted to say a few words, maybe something heartfelt about his son. But instead of heading toward the microphone or the pastor, he walked directly to the casket. From beneath his coat, he pulled out a black 9mm handgun. For a moment, there was stunned silence. People froze, unable to process what they were seeing. And without a word, David opened fire. Susan was shot first. She fell forward onto the ground without a sound. Ryan was hit in the chest as he lunged toward his father. Madison turned to run but was struck in the back. Screams erupted as mourners scrambled for cover. Two cousins who tried to intervene were shot. A family friend who rushed at David in. A panic was hit in the shoulder. The entire attack lasted less than 2 minutes, but the damage was permanent. When police arrived, David was standing quietly beside his son's casket, the gun still in his hand. He didn't resist. He didn't run. Simply placed the weapon on the ground and stared ahead as officers handcuffed him. 5 people were dead, 2 more were injured. And in a single, brutal moment, the funeral had become a massacre. In the aftermath of the funeral massacre, Fairview was left in a state of shock. The violent deaths of 5 people, 4 from the same family, in what was supposed to be a day of mourning, gripped the town in disbelief. The media flooded in, broadcasting images of overturned chairs, blood-stained grass, and crying mourners. David Granger, now behind bars, refused to speak beyond confirming his identity. He showed no remorse, no emotion. Investigators knew they were dealing with more than just a case of a man snapping under pressure. Something was wrong, something buried deeper. As authorities began combing through the Granger family's history, they reopened the investigation into Caleb's death. Initially ruled a suicide, his death now looked suspicious in light of the massacre. Detectives returned to the wooded area behind the high school, this time with forensic specialists. Caleb's belongings were re-examined and a second autopsy was ordered. It revealed bruises on his wrists and arms marks that hadn't been noted in the first report. Experts believed he may have been restrained before he died. The conclusion shifted. Caleb's death no longer looked like suicide. It looked like a staged killing. The most significant breakthrough came when police searched Caleb's bedroom and found his old laptop. Although much of the hard drive had been wiped, digital forensics recovered a hidden folder encrypted and tucked away. Inside were journal entries, some dating back over a year. Caleb had documented disturbing details about life at home. He described his father as strict, controlling, and increasingly unpredictable. There were mentions of verbal abuse, manipulation, and moments of violence. He wrote about walking on eggshells, being afraid to speak, and feeling like a prisoner in his own home. But what truly shocked investigators was a journal entry written just 2 days before Caleb died. In it, he described discovering that David Granger was not his biological father. Caleb had secretly taken a DNA test using an online service. The results confirmed what he had suspected. He shared no genetic link with David. Even more unsettling, he wrote that his brother Ryan had known for over a year, but kept the truth from him. Caleb expressed feelings of betrayal, confusion, and fear. He didn't trust anyone anymore. The entry ended with a haunting line: "If something happens to me, it wasn't suicide. Someone needs to know." Dictators began to suspect that Caleb had confronted his family about the discovery and that the fallout may have led to his murder. The family dynamic was clearly fractured. David's reaction at the funeral seemed less like an emotional breakdown and more like an act of desperation. One final attempt to erase anyone who could expose the truth. The case, once seen as a tragic loss of a troubled teen, now appeared to be part of a much darker and more complicated story. And as police dug deeper, it became clear that the massacre wasn't spontaneous. It had been building quietly under the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. The trial of David Granger began 6 months after the massacre, drawing national attention and intense public interest. Courtrooms were packed with reporters, true crime enthusiasts, and locals desperate for answers. David was charged with 5 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. From the beginning, the prosecution painted a picture of a deeply disturbed man who had spent years controlling his family through fear and manipulation. His actions at the funeral were described not as a spontaneous breakdown, but as a calculated act. It's meant to silence the people who could unravel the secrets he was hiding. Evidence from Caleb's laptop journal played a central role. Prosecutors argued that David murdered Caleb to prevent the truth about his paternity from coming out. And when that truth began to surface anyway, he took steps to eliminate those who might expose him further. The journal entries, especially the one warning that Caleb didn't intend to take his own life, were presented as a dying declaration. The second autopsy findings, bruising, consistent with restraint, added to the theory that Caleb had been killed, not by his own hand, but by someone he feared. As the trial progressed, the defense took a different approach. They didn't deny that David shot his family. Instead, they claimed he was pushed to the edge by unbearable grief and betrayal. His attorney argued that David had been devastated by Caleb's death, and only later discovered that his wife had lied to him for years about the boy's true parentage. According to the defense, David felt that his entire life had been built on deception. They portrayed him not as a monster, but as a broken man, emotionally destroyed by the lies that tore his family apart. It was a desperate attempt to reduce the charges, or at least spare him the death penalty. Then came a twist no one saw coming. Forensic analysis of the weapon used in Caleb's death revealed partial fingerprints that did not belong to David, but rather to Ryan, Caleb's older brother. The prints were smudged, suggesting they had been wiped, but not entirely removed. The revelation caused an immediate stir in the courtroom. Prosecutors quickly shifted focus. Had Ryan helped stage the scene to look like a suicide? Was he involved in some way? Or had he simply discovered the gun afterward and tried to hide the evidence out of fear? Unfortunately, Ryan was no longer alive to answer those questions. The court had no way of verifying his role, and the ambiguity left a troubling gap in the narrative. It became one of the most debated aspects of the case. With Caleb dead, Ryan gone, and David silent, much of the truth remained elusive. Before the trial could reach a verdict, another shocking development halted the proceedings. David Granger was found dead in his jail cell early one morning. Hanging from a bedsheet tied to a vent, his body was discovered during routine rounds. There was no suicide note, no final statement, and no closure. His death ended the trial abruptly, leaving behind a maze of unanswered questions and a family history, now permanently stained by violence and mystery. With David Granger's death, the legal proceedings came to an abrupt and unsatisfying end. There would be no verdict, no sentencing, no official record of guilt or innocence. The case was closed on paper, but in reality nothing felt resolved. Fairview was left to grapple with a tragedy that defied logic, a massacre rooted in years of buried secrets, hidden tensions, and a family unraveling from the inside out. What began as the death of a quiet teenager had spiraled into one of the most violent and complex cases the town and the nation had ever seen. The Granger home was sealed off for weeks as investigators combed through every drawer, hard drive, and document. The more they searched, the clearer the picture became. David Granger had kept tight control over his household. Financial records revealed accounts in his name only. Surveillance footage from the property showed he had installed cameras around the house months before Caleb's death. With no explanation, A spiral-bound notebook hidden in a locked toolbox contained cryptic notes about family betrayal, fatherhood, and what he called the collapse of the bloodline. These entries didn't offer solid evidence of his actions, but they painted a portrait of a man obsessed with power and control. Someone who saw truth not as healing but as a threat. Town held a second memorial, this time not just for Caleb but for the entire family. It was somber, subdued, and filled with unanswered questions. People who had known the Grangers for years stood in silence, unsure what to believe. Was David a grieving father who simply broke under pressure, or had he been hiding something monstrous all along? The discovery of Caleb's journal pointed to years of suffering behind closed doors. The suggestion that Ryan may have known, nor even participated in staging. Caleb's death made it clear the dysfunction ran deeper than anyone realized. Over time, theories began to circulate. Some believed David killed Caleb and staged it as a suicide to protect his reputation. Others thought Ryan, furious over the DNA test and the disruption it caused, might have acted out of fear or misplaced loyalty. There were even those who believed Susan had known the truth all along and had tried to cover it up. None of it could be proven. Everyone involved was gone. The few surviving relatives, mostly distant cousins, refused to speak publicly. They sold the Granger house within weeks of the trial ending and moved away. The story faded from the headlines, but it never left Fairview. Evergreen Cemetery, once just a quiet resting place, became the site of grim curiosity. Visitors would walk past the Granger headstones, whispering about the boy who had died, the father who killed his family, and the truth that may have been buried with them all. What remained was a sense of unease, a reminder that even in the quietest of towns, beneath the surface of ordinary families, something terrible can be waiting. And sometimes the real story dies with the last person who could tell it.